Hello, everyone. This is going to be a fun and cozy group, so I'm excited to be here with you. Thank you for giving me 30 or 20 minutes before your lunch. What is it? Just 1 minute? 2 hours. Okay, good. 2 hours. So hopefully my sharing of Africa will be insightful to you. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit of something. Hopefully it'll be fun, and hopefully it'll be inspirational leading into lunch. So my name is Frances. I'm from California, from River of Life Christian Church. I am the events director at the church, and I'm also the community or communications liaison for our international daughter churches, which includes 11 churches in Africa, with over 100 daughter churches in Africa. I personally have been to Africa 9 times, and this upcoming year in 2017 will be my 10th time to Africa. So I'm very excited to be here to share with you about Africa, because I feel like not many people have been and not too many people know about it. So before I begin, I'm just going to kind of introduce you a little bit to the background of Africa. I might throw out some numbers at you, but I promise it'll get better. Okay, so let's start. So Africa today, currently there are 56 nations in Africa with a population of about 1.1 billion people. And that includes more than 3,500 tribes and over 2,000 local dialects. And Africa alone makes up for 15% of the world population. Africa is commonly divided into 2 divisions. The first is Northern Africa, and that is what you typically know of as Egypt, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco. And the rest of Africa is what we know as the Sub-Sahara. And that basically just means the mountain regions of Africa. Africa is a continent that is very rich in natural resources, but it's actually filled with poverty, and there's a couple reasons for that. There's high government corruption, so that means that any funds that come into the country never get down to the people. Most people still live in huts, or they live in areas without water and electricity. As you know and have probably heard in the news, there are many civil wars that can be due to religion, and that can just be due to conflicts between the different people groups and tribes. There's also language barriers. As I mentioned, there's over 2,000 local dialects in the entire continent of Africa. And I don't know if you know this, but Africa, they used to be divided up into British and French colonies back in previous wars. So there's a lot of countries that speak English, and they're the British colonies, and there's countries that speak French, and that's what we call the French colonies, and they don't have anything to do with each other. Last but not least, there's lack of a good transportation system in Africa. Because the British and the French countries don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, there's not actual roads and transportation methods to get from one country to another. So for example, if you're in Ghana, which is an English country, traditionally before you would have to fly all the way out to someplace like London in Germany and then fly back into Africa to get into a French country such as Togo. The road conditions are also really bad. In most areas, there are no roads, so that makes it really difficult for people to travel. Last but not least, there's also, as you know, lots of rivers and bodies of water, but unfortunately their infrastructure isn't set up. So even though there's cargo ships that come, they don't necessarily have a place to dock to get all the goods to the people in the countries. So let's talk a little bit about religion, because that's kind of why we're here today. The major religions in Africa are Islam, which is also known as Muslim, Christianity, Voodoo, with small pockets of Hindu and Buddhist countries. So let's look at how they are divided. North Africa is 90% Islam or Muslim. Eastern Africa, the majority are Christian, except for a couple countries such as Djibouti, Somalia, Comoros, Mayotte, Mauritius, which is a small island which is actually Hindu, and that's the only country that is Hindu. Southern Africa, as you may know, is 90% Christian. Central Africa, the majority is Christian, except for one country called Chad, which leads us to West Africa. And I think that a lot of, we want to give special focus to West Africa because it is the only region of Africa where there is not one dominant religion. In fact, it is 50% Muslim and 50% Christianity. So when we think about Africa, we think that West Africa is actually the battleground of religion and winning the kingdom for God. So a lot of what we talk about is going to be about West Africa and how we can win that part of the area. So now I'll be talking a little bit about the importance of missions in Africa. We kind of talked about this a little bit if you were in the morning session, if you paid attention to the video. Africa has the fastest growing population in all of the world. Currently, Christianity occupies 2.2 billion of the population, and Islam, or Muslim, occupies 1.6 billion. As I mentioned earlier this morning, in 2050, it is projected that it will be equal parts 2.8 billion Christianity and 2.8 billion Muslim, give or take. And it's important to know that when we talk about Christianity, we define it and we're describing it in the broader terms of Christianity, right? So we're talking about Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and other Christianity religions such as that. So why is it important to know that Africa is the fastest growing population in the world? Why is it important, especially to Christianity? And the answer is because of birth rate, which we also briefly touched upon this morning. The Muslim world continues to have the highest birth rate in the world, while most of the Western world and Western civilization, including China, which it wasn't before, is consistently having a decrease in birth rate. As a matter of fact, it's actually in popular culture and very part of the norm now and will be in the future to actually not even have kids. And that's why birth rate is really, really important to acknowledge. In Africa, the average birth rate for an African woman is about 4.7 children in their lifetime, so round that up to 5. And so simply put, we really believe that the growth rate of children in Africa is so important because it directly rivals the birth rate of how Muslims give birth. And also, if you kind of look into culture right now, there's a growing rise of atheists. A lot of the younger generation now are not believers, and if they're not believers now, they won't be. And so we really are depending on birth rate and winning over families now in order to culture Christian families for the future so that we can continue to build the kingdom of God. Okay. The shift of Christian expansion. So as we know, we've always talked about the expansion of Christianity moving westward. While that is still true, there's actually a new trend that Christianity is actually developing even faster and more rapidly in the South, and it's moving it towards that direction, specifically in South America and especially in Africa. In 1900, the Christian population was 3.8 million in Africa, but since 2015, it's now risen to over 400 million, so that's a lot. And by 2050, if the numbers projected that we talked about earlier, Christian population is 2.8 billion. Half of that entire Christian population of 2.8 billion, which is 1.4 billion, is all going to reside in Africa. So that's very interesting to know. And all of the growth is really due to large evangelical events and also crusades. And it's really important for us also to acknowledge the growth of Christianity in Africa. Even the Pope acknowledges this. At the end of December 2015, he paid a special visit to Africa, and he really revealed the importance of missions in Africa. And it's also been said that one of our upcoming popes in the near future might actually also be from Africa as well. And that's the influence of Christianity in Africa. So now I'm going to share with you the challenges of missions in Africa because this is the fun part. But first I'm going to show you a video. Pastor Tom has had his share of struggles and challenges in West Africa. But having witnessed God's blessings and seeing the churches and workers being built up, he's filled with joy and thanksgiving. Aside from the natural challenges of language barriers and cultural differences, ministering in Africa is also a constant battle for religious ground with strong Islamic influences. Therefore, courage and determination is critical in facing the Islamic encroachment through fervent and strategic prayer.
As we are working on the cross-cultural ministry, we are facing many kinds of difficulties. I remember when I came to Africa, the first issue I'm facing is language. When I enter a nation, no matter the official language is English or French, the local people are still using their own local dialect. So my sermon has to be translated into many local dialects. I still remember one time I was preaching in a village. There were 4 people stood on the stage. I preach in English, then translate it into French, then into the first local dialect, then into another one. And I don't know why. When I spoke one sentence in English, it became two sentences in French, and three in the local dialect. And by the time it came back to me, I almost forgot what I was about to say. The second issue is a cultural difference. The way of doing things in Africa is very different from our Western world. In Africa, people just do whatever they can with whatever they have. But in Western culture, we always have to have a complete plan before we even start to do anything. They have different concepts about time also. In fact, we don't care too much about time. That's why I always say, in Africa, waiting for your ride is just like waiting for God. You know it's coming, but you don't know when. It's a great place to learn to enjoy being patient. The third issue is the road condition. We usually take a long time to travel to any place. Not so much because of the distance, but poor road condition. That's why I call them holy road. A road with lots of holes. Oftentimes the car gets stuck in the potholes, and because of that, cars break down easily. So every time when we travel, it's quite frequent for us to stop for car repairs. Not only the cars suffer, our heat also suffer. I remember one time after our short-term mission trip to Africa, a sister told me, Pastor, next time remind us to bring a seat cushion. All this year, as I preach the gospel in Africa, I felt the urgency of evangelism. Maybe you ask, what's so urgent about it? Because even though Jesus had given us the Great Commission for 2,000 years, but today we are living a different time than the early day church. Just like playing a soccer game. The way you play the last 2 minutes is totally different from the way you play the first 2 minutes, isn't it? For the first 2 minutes, you can take it easy. But for the last 2 minutes, it is so critical that you just have to give all you have. And I believe now we are in the last 2 minutes of the kingdom harvest time. Especially when I preach the gospel in the African village. I find out that the villagers are typically unoccupied. If you tell them about Jesus, they will believe in Jesus. If you tell them about Allah, they will believe in Allah. It all depends on who reaches them first. Muslim has more resources. So whenever they reach a village, first they will build a nice mosque. After they build it, they just ring the bell, calling the villagers to come to pray. And soon they become Muslim. For us, we don't have too much resource. When we reach a village, we just gather the villagers and share the gospel to them. Once people accepted the Lord, we will ask the chief to give us a permission to buy a piece of land. And sometimes the chief will give us land for free. Then we will build a simple shed proclaiming this is a church. When the Muslims saw there's a church in the village, they will bypass it and go to the next village. We will do the same. When we saw that there's a mosque in the village, we will bypass it and go to the next village. It all depends on who gets there first. There's an urgency in preaching the gospel in Africa. Today, churches need to rise up and preach the gospel to fulfill the Great Commission.
Okay, so that's a little intro of what life is like and what ministry is like in Africa. So now I'm going to share with you the strategy of how we do missions in Africa. As I mentioned, we have churches and national directors in over 13 countries with over 100 daughter churches. So 4 key strategies. First is that you have to co-labor with local Christian organizations. Let me see where I am on my power. Okay, great. Co-labor with local Christian organizations. There are so many local organizations on the ground that do such great work. Get out to know them, know who they are, know the players, what their work is, but most importantly, participate with them, work alongside them, and build a relationship with them. Number 2, it's really important to learn about local culture and the way that they do church. As I mentioned, and as Pastor Tong mentioned, it's a different world. They do things differently. So the way that we do church is not the way that they may do church. I can give you a couple examples. So when traditionally we think about spreading the gospel, we think gospel tracts. But in Africa, so many people are illiterate, they can't read. Gospel tracts won't mean anything to them. When we think of worship in the Western world, we think 30 minutes, 2 praise songs, 3 worship songs, a prayer, and we're done. In Africa, it's actually 2 hours. Despite your denomination, if you're conservative or not conservative, it's full of dancing, full of drums. It's a totally different world. Cell groups, we do that a lot. We encourage that a lot in Western culture. Cell groups don't necessarily work. Why in Africa? Because polygamy is still very much alive in many of the villages. It's probably not appropriate to have people come over to your house when there's a husband with 4 wives. It doesn't work that way. And last but not least, how you gather people and how you hold meetings. There's a story of Pastor Tong going to Cameroon with the local pastor, and he was told that he's going to do an evangelism event, and so he's really excited to go there. For all of you that don't know, pygmies are local people. They live in the bushes and they live in the trees. So when he went to the place that they were supposed to do it, he found himself in an empty field surrounded by trees, and he asked the local pastor, "There's nobody here." The local pastor just said, "Just preach, go ahead." And he thought it was so silly that he was like, "I'm just gonna preach my sermon to nobody." So there he was, standing there, preaching alone to nobody. And at the end, he had to give an altar call because that's part of his message. And he was thinking, should I give the altar call? There is nobody here. But lo and behold, he gave his altar call. And again, he's in the middle of nowhere surrounded by trees. All of a sudden, he heard the trees rustling. And then all of a sudden, he saw these little hands reaching out, answering the altar call and accepting God into their lives. So it's really important to know the different cultures and the different things that they're used to and adjusting the way that we do ministries out there. I'm really low on time, so I'm going to kind of speed through, so I apologize. It's also important to establish relationships with local churches and local leaders. The most effective way to reach out to Africa, from what we've seen, is to use local pastors, local leaders. It's good to attend pastoral meetings, attend prayer meetings led by local pastors. Again, get to know them, be their friend. Okay. Number 2, and this is a picture of the villages. Number 2, we believe that church planting is the best strategy for evangelism, and the reason is because there's been a lot of crusades. I'm sure you guys all know about Reinhard Bonnke and all of his work, and although he is now retired, crusades and his ministry is still very much alive. But as you know, with all crusades, there's an influx of new believers, but the current churches in place may not necessarily have the resources and the capacity to take care of the new believers. And so we believe that the best way to reach out to these new believers is by planting a church. And church planting is not that hard. It's very easy. You actually just build a shed, buy a couple drums for them, and invite them to come to church, have a leader there to take care of the new believers, and that's how a church is born. It's important to train and send local leaders. I know we might have a lot of missionaries in the room, but this is just what we found to be successful. We know that there's a lot of seminary programs in Africa right now. There's also a lot of online programs in Africa. There's a lot of local leaders who are ready to serve, but they just don't necessarily have the opportunity to serve, and they don't necessarily have the spiritual maturity to serve. So what are the pros and cons of sending missionaries versus sending local leaders? Obviously, the pros of sending a missionary is that it's easy for us to communicate as the church with our missionary. Their maturity, spiritual maturity is there, and they're very fully equipped. However, there are a couple of cons, such as it takes them sometimes a long time to adjust to the culture, adjust to the language. There's also a cost involved in terms of their living expenses. A lot of times if they have family and they have kids, paying for education, et cetera, et cetera. And what we also found is sometimes missionaries will go into an area and sometimes they will bring Western culture with them and kind of transform the local area with Western culture. And we found that sometimes that is not sustainable and not natural to local culture. So what we have done is we've actually found local leaders. The pros and cons of sending local leaders. Pros, obviously, they're of the people, so they are for the people, and they are the people, so they definitely understand. There is no language barrier and there is no culture barrier. And from a financial standpoint, the cost of living is lower because you're paying for the cost of living for what is currently on the ground. Some of the cons is that it may not be so easy to communicate with them because of our language barrier with the local leaders. So what we've done to work with local leaders is, number 1, establish national directors in the nations that we have churches in. And then have them take care of the training for the pastors. Number 2, we establish annual pastor conferences for fellowship and training for all the pastors. It's important to build community, especially in areas where it may have a lot of Muslims. You need them to feel equipped and empowered by one another. Number 3, working with local leaders, we establish a response system, which is weekly reporting of attendance and prayer items, and that way we are in sync with what they are doing on the ground. So you may think, oh, you've given me the strategies, but how do I find these local leaders? And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in regards to forming relationships with people on the ground. So how to recruit local leaders? Number 1, you can get referrals from local mission organizations. If you build a relationship with them, they're very, very willing to help you find able people who are ready for the field and ready for the task at hand. We started working with EHC when we first went to our first country of Africa, which is in Togo. From EHC, we found our first pastor, and from our first pastor built our first nation, which has turned into 13 nations. Another way is to recruit from local seminars. Again, this is where building relationships with pastors on the ground is very important. They know a lot of the people there. They know who's ready to be sent out into the field. So knowing them and getting the referrals is very important. This is how we started our church planting in India. We found 2 people, and that's how we started our work in India. Okay, gospel goes hand in hand with charity, of course. So it's very good to, help the local people with spiritual needs, but we can never ever forget about their physical needs. Africa is in an area with extreme poverty. Most of them don't have education. Some people don't have a place to live. Some places don't have food to eat on the table. So it's really important to also help them out in that way, because that's how you show God's love to them. We in Africa have started doing schools run by local people. We've established orphanages also run by local people. We formed career training schools, and we also have a Love to West Africa program, which is a Christmas gift program that we send to all the, where we send gifts to all the children in all of the villages. So it's important to really show them God's love in addition to taking care of their spirituality. So last but not least, and I'm going to close right now, is that right now is the best time for us to go into Africa. It's really the golden opportunity for the Chinese community, Chinese churches to rise up. If you go anywhere in Africa, everybody, without a doubt, will have a big smile on their face, and they will say to you, ni hao. And do you know that there's 3 words that break all barriers of language, and that is amen, hallelujah, and the third is ni hao. And the reason that Africa as a whole is so accepting and loving to Chinese people is because the Chinese government actually started a lot of projects in Africa for Africa. They've also built a lot of stadiums for the nations and given them as gifts. So the Chinese influence is very visible to all of the people in Africa. And because of that, they are very open and very receptive to Chinese people. And so it's good for us as Christians who want to reach them because they're very open to us. So as Pastor Tong shared in his video, you can kind of do an analogy as this is a soccer field. We are in the final 2 minutes. God has prepared the entire way for us and opened the doors for us, and all it really is, and he's just left the last winning kick for us to go through and win the kingdom of God for him. So thank you so much. If you guys have any questions about Africa, I can stay a little bit longer to answer them for you. Thank you.
Let me start with 2 mea culpa. The first one, when I finished or finalized my deck, my presentation, I did not get enough time to read the final report, which is related to the Chinese Christian Relief Association in Taiwan. So I encourage you to read it. Unfortunately, I won't cover it today. And having said that, talking about covering, I'm really doing this presentation at the risk of oversimplification. In 20 minutes, I don't know what I can tell you, but I do want to really thank the Hong Kong Church Network for the poor ministry that they've handed out the summary of the action report, which is really our first case that I want to cover. But before I do that, I have not heard any research analyst say thanks to all the researchers. So I want to do that right now. Let's give a big hand to those who write the report, because it takes a lot of time, sweat, and tears. But I want to give a shout out to the staff as well. They're staying at the corner over there, sort of taking our requests, and we want to thank you. We love you as well. The first case, by the way, here's the MO. I'm going to walk through each case, offer some feedback, and then at the end, I'll give you a couple of what I call reflection questions, and then we'll do some discussion later. The first one is HKCMP. What this case is all about is really how do we see poverty and how do we respond to it, right? And by the way, if you really want to read the whole stuff, or the summary is in there, I'm not going to repeat it, right? So poverty is not really simply a personal individual issue, but it's a structural issue. So how do we respond to it? It's not just simply handing out food and so on. We need to be able to dig into the systemic issue, the root cause. Lingering from generation to generation is not a socio-economic issue. As far as Christian is concerned, it's a theological issue that tests our collective authenticity of our faith, of the Lord and love for human being. so the role, not the role, it's actually the scope of this report. They have multiple roles, but as far as this scope, the scope of this report is concerned, they're focusing on love in action and mentoring program. But the two key things that lie behind this particular research report is simply this, that A, the agency is not on the front line fighting poverty per se. Not that they don't do that. They see themselves as the intermediary, the facilitator, the folks that bring resources together. If I can use a marketing term, they're creating a value chain. They're creating a supply chain. They understand that the small business or large business may have a lot of resources, and yet there are targets over there who are poor. They stand in between and sort of bring them together and hold their hands a little bit. The second one is efficacy. Efficacy is simply this. They also understand the saying that if I give you a fish for a day, I'll feed you for a day. Right? Feed you a fish, I'll feed you for the day. But if I teach you how to fish, I can teach you how to fish for the whole time or eat for the whole time. So the advocacy is really trying to do that. Mentoring program and all the other good stuff. And from their own self-evaluation, there are pros and cons. They really understand that there is a need, and therefore they were able to create synergy across what I call earlier the value chain, so that the strength of each part can be leveraged. The whole concept of the adage that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. And this is where we see here. And also being able to deepen the collaboration across the chain, and they believe what they do is consistent with Christian value. But the challenge is that it takes a lot of time. And planting takes a lot of time. Building relationship takes a lot of time. And in this particular ministry, take a lot of time. And sometimes partners are difficult to find, and relationships are very difficult to sustain. And they are kind of, because the church is not looking at them as sort of a church per se, raising funds is a challenge. Finding volunteers is a challenge. So as far as learning is concerned, the challenge from my perspective lies with how do we translate the need of the poor across what I call corporate culture. So be careful with this term. It's not corporate in terms of a corporation, but the corporate culture that is native in an organization. I look at church as an organization. I know this is a bad thing to do. However, each church carries its own value, cultures, and things like that. So how do you translate that and make it a priority and make it synergy so that they can do them together? And then the learning here is that if the Lord believed that this is the right thing to do, meaning blessed are you who are poor. Now I quote Luke because Luke is more literal about poor, not poor in spirit, but poor, whereas Matthew has a different stance. And this is something biblical scholar can kind of figure out the differences between the two. But the Lord is really clear. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be, and where the poor is. And if the Lord looks after the poor, so must we. The feedback I have for this case is simply this, that what are the transferable or the transportable determinants for success in this type of a ministry? Now, this ministry is in Hong Kong. This ministry is in Hong Kong. The success factor that helped them become such a flourishing ministry, can they be applied somewhere else? Food for thought, food for thought. Second case, the Blessed and Blessing Church in Taiwan. What this case is all about, as far as I'm concerned, it illustrates an incorporated approach. Now let me stop here, the incorporated approach. Today, Edmund Chan talks about assimilation. This is a term that is really loaded. We study sociology of religion. We talked about how a minor culture got forced into a bigger mainstream dominant culture. That's assimilation. I think incorporation in this case, I'm not critiquing Edmund, I'm just using different words. In this case, it's an incorporated culture. In other words, how does a church relate to the culture that is around you? And do so in such a way that we can do what we call the building social capital as well, as opposed to bonding or warring. Right? Robert Putnam, in his famous book, Bowling Alone in the Alley, illustrates this very, very clearly, that we have two functions in our organization. One is preaching, one is warring. And as far as this church is concerned, they're trying to really reach the community by embedding themselves in the indigenous culture. So what they do, For example, they pick up trashes. And when there's Chinese festival, they have parades, they dress up and walk around as a participant. They would open up their facilities for the community center or for the community to come in, do their own thing. They may have, I'm just making it up, like they may have yoga, they may have, learnings, courses, and things like that. Not necessarily under their own banner. So they just allow them to use, of course. By doing that, people become to really understand what Christian love and practices, are all about. They also, I'm amazed, if you look at Edmund's 8 mark, this is, as far as I'm concerned, a change management model, right? You start with vision and you start with implementation and execution. This is a very process-driven model. They assess, look at what they need. Out of the need emerges a vision, and from the vision, they understand that there are different types of people around them. They, just like banks or other product companies, they segmentize. So they do a segmentization theory, and then they execute and mobilize. The challenge of this particular case is simply this. As far as ministry and culture is concerned, from a Taiwanese standpoint, just like many other people and tribes, deeply wired in and affected by their indigenous culture. Duh, everybody knows that. But change of culture, however, requires not a sprint, but a marathon, with a long-term perspective to eradicate misconception or hostility locals may have developed towards Christianity. But let me pause a little bit. Doing this type of stuff is really difficult because you can relate to this when you start a new thing in your church. There's a lot of naysayer, right? Edmund talks about agreement, not commitment. I talk about enrollment. How do people enroll in that program? There are a lot of different thinkings. And the first thing that when they see you fail, especially the leader who disagree with you, you know what they say? I told you so. So it takes a lot of time, take a lot of gut, take a lot of commitment and persistence and so on. Drawing from Leonard Sweet, how many of you have read Leonard? Put up your hand. Not a lot. Well, he talks about the emerging church model. He talks about MRI, not the MRI that I take once a year to figure out whether my cancer is still there, which is true, by the way. Mine is coming up in October, hopefully the last one, 5 years anniversary. Thank you. M, missional. R, relational. I, incarnational. So when we do church, not only must it be missional, not only must it be relational, and relationality is the key. Higher the relationality, the bigger the stickiness, the adhesiveness of the church. But incarnational, this is what they're talking about. However, the B&B church, I call it B&B, I'm sorry, simplifying a little bit. The B&B church make a very clear statement, right? While many in the emergent church model rejects the dichotomy between church and the world, the B&B church, even though they were embedded in the community, maintains a crisis about community and its truth cannot be compromised. And I want to draw you to the classic study of Christianity and culture, right? Kraft and Niebert. I mean, I don't need to repeat it. For those of you who study theology, know what we're talking about. How do we deal with culture at the same time and maintain that distinctiveness, that uncompromising identity that we must uphold? My feedback, a very good process-driven model to engage in connecting with the community in an embedded fashion. How much of this embedded model can, again, in fact, be extended to culture that are not necessarily native to your congregation? Now, remember, this is Taiwan. There's no need to worry about language, other than speaking Taiwanese or Hakka or Samen, Minanhua, right? But you don't need to worry about it. And when you talk about cultural celebration, you don't even need to think about, what is Mid-Autumn Festival? You don't need to think about it. The next case, however, give you an extra challenge, an added challenge. Next case is 105 Gibson Center, where I come from. A good friend of mine wrote this. And this is interesting. Look at the subtitle. A report not about community service, not even about discipling. It's only about, I'm having a tough time pronouncing this, conscientization. Wow, big word. My friend Jonathan Chan. What's this case is all about? Well, it's talking about disciple development through community service engagement in a multicultural setting that encourages, the word assimilation. Canadians like you to assimilate with them, but if you do things in a ethnic enclaves such as his church, where his church is located, ethnic barrier may be an issue. Think language. Think different traditions. How do you do that? With a lot of love and care and a lot of energies and so on. Here is what he stated in terms of research purpose. Let me read. This current research emphasizes discipleship to explore how 105 Gibson Center, through social concern, to achieve disciple training. From the onset, the 105 project aims at shaping the future of the neighborhood. Cannot depart from viewing the calling and participation disciples in historical contextual terms. I was somewhat confused, actually. What is the research purpose? The research purpose is to shape the future of the neighborhood or discipleship training. You must have already imagined the conversation I had with him. What's it all about? But what's up about conscientization? Well, here's another big word, right? It refers to a person's move through a certain educational method from a lower to more primitive consciousness to a higher level. This process represents human beings' search for freedom, which through conscientization will result in obtaining critical knowledge of the world. Let me give you my skinny. Here's my skinny. It's pretty simple, right? Higher awareness leads to better self-understanding and self-empowerment. Simple as that. Now, I mean, he's going to disagree with me, I know that. Here's the overall finding. This is his word now, not mine, right? A higher degree of conscientization was reported in participants after the engagement with the community service. Right? So my feedback is, it's a really well-written report, by the way. If you have chance to read it, it really follow the format of ARMD. My feedback to the organization here is a good start in terms of looking at ARMD as a methodology to sort of probe into issues. Maybe the next round is to give them a template in terms of how to write the report. Because the first two reports sounds to me, looks to me more like a ministerial report than a research report. But that's okay, we still learn from them. So this is not a criticism, but a feedback, right? So, but I have questions that I did not for the first two. Here's my questions. Should community service in offering social support motivated by Christian values not be worthy of being an end game? I mean, not the final end game being evangelization and discipleship training, disciple making, but can it not be an end game fulfilling the hospitality mandate that the Lord has so passionately exhorted us to accomplish, right? Should it be just simply an agency to achieve disciple making, kind of a pass-through, not as an end game? And really, from a organizational standpoint, this case should be in the discipleship panel, not in the community service panel. Okay, I have two reflection questions. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, good, very good, thank you, good. Walter Brueggemann, how many of you know the Old Testament scholar? Thank you so much. No, I don't need to explain. It's called by Gander Dean. If you have time to read Almost Christians, a really worthy book to read as far as youth ministry in the state is concerned. You know, Dean, the Clark, Martinson, Cook, these are the four kind of major guys in working on theology for youth ministry in the state. He basically said that, hey, he argues that the cultural condition of postmodernity require the church to function as a bilingual community. Conversion in both the tradition of the church and the narrative of the dominant culture. Brueggemann offers 2 Kings, 2 Kings 18 to 19. You remember the Assyrians is now coming to the war, shouting Hebrews in disdain languages. And the delegation that includes Asper, by the way, you remember Asper entering into sanctuary the first? He happened to be one of the 3 guys saying to Assyrians, hey, don't talk to us in Hebrew. I can do the translation. We need people who can understand and adjudicate values. Not just simply understand, but adjudicate what's right or wrong. What are they coming at us? Secularization, postmodernism, pluralism, millennials' concern, and the rising of the nuns. What are they telling us? So this is reflection number 1, being bilingual. The number 2 is this. There's no one-size-fits-all. So you can't just simply transplant this and say, hey, we're doing poor in Toronto, we're doing this in Malaysia. You don't do that, right? So the biggest challenge lies not as much in making a choice in which model pathway you or your church needs to follow, or Emily as a grammar, needs to follow. or Emily's that's in how to build an inner community that sustains support for the outer engagement. We need to have that inner reservoir and that ability to determine for our own sake, in our own context, bearing witnesses in that local environment through community service. So the question is this: what are the values in the community practices, such as fidelity, faithfulness, hospitality, until the church became institutionalized in 4th century? All the writings that I have come to read, they truly believe that receiving a stranger is actually receiving Christ. Not that we don't believe today, but they truly look at it by serving a stranger in the household. How many of you, I want to ask you this question. I asked this question 2 weeks ago in the church. I've been a Christian 40 years. How many of you have heard 3rd John being preached on a Sunday? What's 3rd John's all about? If not about hospitality. Yeah? So we sometimes compromise ourselves. So what we want to ask ourselves is, what promises, or not just commitment, promises are pledges. I have the same problem with the word commitment, right? But I got hijacked by the other guy. But I say promises. What are the pledges you need to make to hold in order to maintain and sustain these values in practice? So I have 3 discussion questions for you. The first one is, to what degree we must be cultural entrepreneur? Russell Jiang from the West Coast, my friend here know of him, talked about church leaders are being able to kind of dance around a little bit between the wall, but being able to judge the secular values in a way can bring the salience of our faith. How can we maintain being bilingual and be faithful to the Lord and yet servants to the world when engaging in community services? Again, values. But really, last is this. In short, what does a set of what I call incarnational DNA, things that you must have in you to engage in this type of stuff? So with that, thank you for your attention. I appreciate you nodding the head a little bit for me. Thank you.